week I spent a lot of time working in the Grow to Give garden. I was out there turning earth, planting snap peas and radishes. I also spent some time inside Bleecker Hall, starting tiny seeds in little inch-by-inch seed starter trays. It's been a great way to take my mind off the current reality of our situation here in New York. With over 100,000 people infected with coronavirus in the state, and how many more not sick enough to merit testing, the garden is a good way to rest my mind after a conference call with clergy of the diocese, where we talk about the passing of one of our colleagues. In times like these, it almost seems obscene that the emergence of spring means the natural world becomes more and more beautiful each day. But this is the season for gardening, and so I garden. Yesterday, I waved to Seamus Mitchell, our senior warden, and his family across the 16-foot raised bed as we traded off at the garden. We spoke briefly about our plans for the season, standing at opposite ends, a stark reminder of how this spring is different. One rainy day earlier in the week, I watched water drip into the old pump house, which has become the garden shed, and wondered about the plans that we had made to fix the roof. A group had been planning to do it yesterday, actually, but that, of course, did not happen. And as I planted peas on Friday, I wondered if it will only be me there to harvest them. It's hard to know what to do in times like this. Hard to know how to prepare. It's a lot of feelings to have at once, gazing over the glistening water of St. John's Pond as a pair of ospreys soar overhead. I can see the church on the other side of the pond, and I wonder when we will all return. I wonder what sort of plans Jesus and the disciples had as they entered Jerusalem on that day, the day that we remember as Palm Sunday. They knew that something was up, that was for sure. Jesus had just restored the sight of 2 blind men, so things seemed to be going well. But he'd also been talking about his own death a lot. He tells about his own coming death at least 3 times before this point in the Gospel of Matthew. We do know that when the time comes to return to Jerusalem, there must have been a buzz in the city about this guy. They stop at the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is a place where you are able to gaze across a deep valley and see the city of Jerusalem on the other side of the temple. It's quite a bit further than the distance I gazed across the pond to St. John's Church. But Jerusalem is no less visible across the low, dry Kidron Valley. While they're there at the Mount of Olives, the disciples acquire a donkey and a colt for Jesus to ride. As they descend from the Mount of Olives, word must have gotten out, because a crowd begins to gather. And as Jesus enters the city, they lay their cloaks and they cut branches from the surrounding trees to spread on the road as Jesus passes. They knew that something special was happening, and they grabbed whatever was at hand. They had no time to prepare, but they knew how to respond with what they had. That's how Palm Sunday begins, by remembering this triumphal entry in the first gospel that we read at the door, if you were there with us right at 8 o'clock. But Palm Sunday doesn't stay there. It moves quickly, perhaps too quickly for some, on to the Passion narrative as we just watched together. Before we know it, we are hearing the story of the Last Supper, of Jesus' arrest, of his interrogation by the authorities, of the crowd's demand for his execution, and finally of his crucifixion and death. We are given a taste of what is to come in Holy Week this coming week, on Maundy Thursday when Jesus shares his final meal and is then arrested, and on Good Friday when he is crucified and dies. It's a lot to take in, all in one Sunday morning service. And yet, how different is this from the breadth of emotion many of us are encountering right now in our day-to-day lives? Forsythia in full bloom, baby leaves popping out of the trees, osprey returning, human joys as well. Babies being born right into our own congregation, new jobs, new admissions to college and graduate school. Spring is continuing, even as we try to stay 6 feet from one another. Contrasting these signs of life with worries about illness, family members, getting the supplies we need. Will there be flour? More and more we know people who are impacted by this illness directly. If you're anything like me, one moment you are sitting in amazement at the beauty of spring, catching up with old friends on the phone that you haven't talked to in forever, and the next moment you are in tears over the disruption and the loss and the confusion. From one day to the next, I don't know how things are going to be, and I don't know how long things are going to last. It's hard to know how to prepare. Palm Sunday contains within it the whole spectrum of human emotion, from the highest highs to the lowest lows. And this is not a mistake. It's right there in the design. And it reminds us sometimes that our lives are just like this too, a jumbled up mixture of emotion. It can be hard to know what to do in these situations, hard to know how to prepare. But then I remember the crowds that greeted Jesus as he entered Jerusalem. The crowds who paid attention to what was going on around them, who noticed that something special was happening, and who responded with what they had. They didn't have time to pre-order palms from whoever it is that sends us the palms. They didn't have the chance to do that. They just grabbed cloaks and branches from the trees that were around them. Just like I hope some of you have grabbed branches from the trees around your house this morning. The people greeting Jesus knew little more than that he was coming. And they had little warning about that. But they show us that what God longs for from us is not our super preparation, but our attention and our response. We don't need the perfect palms. All we need to do is to grab what is around us and to see what God is doing. Sometimes this means breaking out the sewing machine and the old fabric stash. Sometimes it means picking up an extra pie and a bag of clementines for a neighbor. Sometimes it means saying, I know how to do that. Let me show you how. Sometimes it means taking out a book and going out to the porch to read in the sun for a moment. God is calling us to bring what we have, not what we don't have, to meet this challenge. This week, as we walk through Holy Week, look around you and see what you already have that prepares you to God's call. Look around and see what branches you may have overlooked. This week, God walks with us through the whole range of human experience, through every emotion imaginable. But God doesn't expect that we have some fancy prepared solution. God instead invites us to look around and to respond with what we have. This year, there may be no palms to distribute, but I bet you have something even better to offer.